A fist came down on the wooden bar so hard that 3 glasses jumped and one fell over, spilling amber liquid across the scarred wood. Every head in the room turned toward the sound. The man behind that fist stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds. His beard was dark and streaked with silver, grown long enough to brush the top of his leather vest. The patches on that vest told a story that most people in that part of the country already knew by reputation. His name was Harlan Graves, and he was the president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, and when he hit something, it stayed hit. But he was not looking at the bar. He was looking at the front door. 2 old people stood frozen in the doorway. The husband had one hand gripping his wife's elbow, and that hand was shaking. Not from weakness, from the effort of holding her upright. The wife clutched a small brown purse against her ribs like it was the last thing she owned in this world. Her face was the color of old paper. 6 other men in leather vests turned on their stools. Nobody spoke. The jukebox in the corner had gone silent between songs, and the timing of that silence was so perfect it felt arranged. The big man stood up from the bar. He was the boss of the room. The patches said so. The tattoos climbing up his neck said so. The way every other man in that place adjusted his posture when Harlan moved said so most of all. He looked the old man up and down. Then he looked at the old woman. He looked at the way her chest was moving too fast, too shallow, like a bird that had been held too long in a child's hand. The husband cleared his throat. He asked a question, 5 words. And what he asked the most feared biker in 4 counties would change every man in that room. But we need to go back. We need to go back to that morning to a small guest bedroom in a house in Pennsylvania where Dorothy Whitfield opened her eyes at 5:15 in the morning and lay still in the gray light and listened to her husband breathe. Frank was sleeping on his back. He always slept on his back. 58 years of marriage, and the man had never once rolled onto his stomach. He breathed in long, slow waves, and Dorothy had been listening to that sound for so long that she could not imagine silence without it. She did not want to imagine it. But lately, in the quiet hours before dawn, she had begun to. She was 79 years old. Her heart was failing. Not in the dramatic way that people imagined when they heard the words heart condition, not the clutching of the chest and the falling to the floor. Hers was a slow recession, a tide going out a little further each month. The left ventricle was not pumping the way it should. The cardiologist in Philadelphia had used words like ejection fraction and systolic dysfunction and surgical intervention. And Dorothy had listened to all of it with the calm, steady attention of a woman who had spent 30 years as an emergency room nurse at Mercy General Hospital. She knew what those words meant. She knew what the numbers on the echocardiogram meant. She knew in the way that only a person trained in medicine can know exactly how much time the numbers were suggesting. She had not told Frank. She had told him that the doctor said to keep it calm, keep it cool, stay hydrated, take the medication on schedule. All of which was true. What she had not told him was that the doctor had also said the word surgery, and that she had looked at that doctor, a man 30 years younger than her, who had probably never held a dying soldier's hand, and she had said no. Not at my age, not with those odds. I would rather have 2 good years than 5 bad ones. The doctor had written something in her chart and nodded the way doctors nod when they disagree, but know they cannot force the issue. Dorothy had buttoned her coat and walked out of that office and driven home and made meatloaf for dinner and not said a word about any of it. That had been 4 months ago. Now she lay in the guest bedroom of her daughter Janet's house in Pennsylvania and listened to Frank breathe and thought about the trip ahead of them. 300 miles of highway, most of it through the mountains to their other daughter Elaine's house in Tennessee. Frank had wanted to fly. Dorothy had said no. She had said she wanted to see the country. She had said it had been years since they had driven through the mountains in the summer, and she missed the way the light came through the trees in the afternoon. What she had not said was that this was the last time she would be strong enough to make this trip. She knew it the way she knew her own name. One more summer, one more drive between daughters, one more chance to sit in the passenger seat of the old Buick and watch America roll past the window and feel the particular kind of peace that comes from being in motion with the person you love. Frank stirred. He opened his eyes and looked at her and smiled the way he always smiled when he saw her first thing in the morning, like he was surprised she was still there, like he could not believe his luck. "Morning, Dot." "Morning, Frank." You sleep. Some. He sat up slowly, the way 81-year-old men sit up one vertebra at a time. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and put his feet on the floor and sat there for a moment getting his bearings. Frank Whitfield had been getting his bearings every morning for 63 years, ever since he came home from Korea, with a piece of Chinese shrapnel in his left knee and a silence in his chest that took Dorothy 15 years to learn how to sit with. He had been 18 when he enlisted, a farm boy from Iowa who had never been further from home than Des Moines. They sent him to a frozen peninsula on the other side of the world and asked him to hold a hill that did not have a name, just a number. He held it. He carried 2 wounded boys through frozen mud to a medic station that was half a mile away through enemy fire. One of those boys lived, the other did not. Frank did not talk about either one. He came home. He got a job at the post office. He married Dorothy, the girl who sold flowers at Pemberton's General Store on Main Street, the girl with the brown eyes and the laugh that sounded like water over rocks. They bought a small house. They had 2 daughters. They lived a life so quiet and so ordinary that most people who knew them would not have thought to use the word remarkable. But Dorothy knew. She knew that every morning Frank woke up and chose to be kind, and that choosing to be kind after what he had seen was the most remarkable thing a person could do. They ate breakfast at Janet's kitchen table. Janet made eggs and toast and coffee that was too strong, the way Janet always made it, and Dorothy drank it without complaint because she loved her daughter and because strong coffee was not the hill she was going to die on. Not today. Janet's husband Roger was already at work. Their 2 kids were grown and gone. The house was quiet in the way that houses get when the children leave, and the couple who remains has not yet figured out what to do with all the empty rooms. "You sure you don't want to stay another day?" Janet asked. She was looking at her mother the way she had been looking at her mother for the past year, with a careful, searching attention that Dorothy recognized because she had worn that same look on her own face 1,000 times in the emergency room, looking at patients and trying to gauge how much time. "We need to get to Elaine's sweetheart. She's expecting us for dinner tomorrow. You could fly. Roger could drive you to the airport." "I want to drive." Janet looked at Frank. Frank looked at Dorothy. Frank knew better than to argue with that tone. 58 years had taught him to recognize the difference between Dorothy's negotiable voice and her non-negotiable voice, and this was the latter. They loaded the car at 9 in the morning. The car was a 1987 Buick LeSabre, pale blue with a bench seat in the front and a trunk big enough to hold 2 suitcases, a cooler of sandwiches, a thermos of water, Dorothy's medication bag, and a folded quilt that Dorothy insisted on bringing everywhere. Because you never know Frank, you just never know. Frank had taken care of that car the way a man takes care of his own body. Oil changes on schedule. New tires last spring, the engine tuned, and the brakes checked, and the fluids topped off before every long trip. He had owned the Buick for 22 years. It was the last new car he would ever buy, and he had known that when he bought it, and he had chosen it because it was built in an era when Americans still built things to last. But cars get old. People get old. Things give out. The air conditioning had quit 2 states ago somewhere in the hills of West Virginia. Frank had pulled over and checked the vents and checked the controls and checked the fuse box under the dashboard, and none of it made any difference. The AC was dead. He had looked at Dorothy and she had waved her hand and said, "Roll the windows down, Frank. I survived 30 years in an emergency room without air conditioning. I can survive a car ride." But that had been morning. That had been the cool side of the day. Now it was past 2 in the afternoon, and the temperature outside was 91 degrees, and the wind coming through the open windows was not a breeze. It was a blow dryer. It was the kind of heat that sits on your chest and makes every breath feel like work. Dorothy had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, not clutching, not grabbing, just resting there the way she did when she was monitoring. Frank glanced over. He saw the hand. He saw the way her lips were pressed together. He saw the thin film of sweat on her forehead. "How you doing over there?" "I'm fine, Frank." "You don't look fine." "I look exactly the way a 79-year-old woman looks when it's 90 degrees and there's no air conditioning. Stop watching me and watch the road." He watched the road. The road was a 2-lane blacktop that wound through the mountains like a snake with no particular destination. They had taken this route before years ago when the girls were young and the drive was an adventure And Frank would point out hawks circling above the ridgeline, and the girls would press their faces to the windows and count them. Now the road felt longer than it ever had. The trees pressed close on both sides. There were no houses, no farms, no gas stations, just mile after mile of forest and heat and cracked asphalt. At mile marker 41, smoke started curling up from under the hood. Frank saw it first as a shimmer in the air above the dashboard like a heat mirage. Then it thickened. Then it turned white. Then it turned gray. Frank, I see it. He eased the car into the shoulder. The gravel crunched under the tires. He killed the engine. He sat there in the sudden silence and listened to the tick of cooling metal, that small metronomic sound that an engine makes when it stops working and starts dying. Dorothy's eyes were closed. Her hand was still on her chest. You all right, Dot? I'm tired, Frank. I'm just tired. He got out of the car. The heat hit him like a wall. He walked around to the front, popped the hood, and lifted it. Steam rose from the engine in a thick white cloud that smelled like rubber and hot metal. He did not know much about engines, not the way younger men did, men who had grown up with computers in their cars and diagnostic tools in their garages. But he knew what overheating looked like, and he knew what it meant. He pulled out his cell phone, no signal, not one bar. He held it up above his head like he had seen young people do. Nothing. He walked 20 yards up the road and tried again. Nothing. He walked 20 yards back. Nothing. He stood there on the shoulder of a mountain road in the middle of nowhere, holding a phone that could not call anyone next to a car, that could not move, with a wife who could not sit in 90-degree heat, with a heart that was slowly forgetting how to beat. Dorothy opened her door. She put her feet on the gravel. She sat there with her legs hanging out of the car, and she looked up at Frank with an expression that he recognized from all those years in the emergency room. It was her triage face. The face that said, I am assessing the situation and I am not panicking, and you should not panic either. Where are we, Frank? I don't know exactly. Somewhere past that last town, the one with the gas station. That was 40 minutes ago. I know. There's nothing out here. I know that too. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of pills. She shook one into her palm and swallowed it dry without water, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had taken pills dry 1,000 times in supply closets between patients who were coding. How long can you sit here? Frank asked. Not long, not in this heat, an hour maybe less. Frank looked up the road. He looked down the road. The asphalt wavered in the heat. There was nothing in either direction, just trees and sky and the high, thin whine of insects in the grass. And then he heard it. Engines, low and rumbling, not one engine, many. The sound built slowly the way thunder builds, from a vibration in the ground to a pressure in the chest to a roar that swallowed every other sound in the world. A pack of motorcycles came around the bend. 8 of them, maybe 10. Big Harleys, the kind that looked like they had been built for war and then dressed up in chrome. The men on them were the kind of men Frank Whitfield had spent his entire life avoiding, not because he was a coward. He was not a coward. He had proved that on a frozen hill in Korea when he was barely old enough to vote. But because he was a man who had learned that the world had places where different rules applied, and he had chosen to live in the places where the rules were the ones he understood. Long beards, black leather, patches and insignias, tattoos that climbed up their necks and down their arms. They roared past the Buick in a thunder that shook the gravel under Frank's boots and rocked the car on its springs. Dorothy braced her hand against the doorframe. The pack went past. The sound receded. Frank watched them disappear around the next bend. He was about to turn back to the car when he saw brake lights. Half a mile up, the motorcycles slowed. They turned off the highway. They pulled into a parking lot. Frank squinted. There was a sign back there in the trees that he had missed. Weathered wood, hand-painted letters. He could just make it out now. The Iron Horseshoe Saloon. It was a bar, out here in the middle of nothing, and every single one of those bikes was now parked in front of it. Frank looked down at Dorothy. She had seen it too. Her hand was pressed against her chest again. I don't like the looks of this, she said. Neither do I, honey. But it's the only place out here. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. 58 years of marriage had built a language between them that did not require words. She was saying, I am scared, but I trust you. He was saying, I am scared too, but I am going to do this anyway. He helped her stand. She wobbled. He held her up. She found her balance. She held onto his arm, and slowly, one careful step at a time, the two of them made their way along the shoulder of the road toward the saloon. The walk took 10 minutes. It should have taken 3. Frank was sweating through his shirt. Dorothy was breathing in short, shallow pulls that worried him more than the smoke from the engine had. They reached the parking lot. The Harleys were lined up in a neat row chrome, catching the afternoon sun. Frank counted 12 of them. He had only seen 8 or 10 on the highway, which meant others had already been here. Inside somewhere were more men. He looked at his wife. Her lips were pale. Her forehead was damp, but her eyes were steady. Those emergency room eyes. "You wait right here on this bench," he said. There was a wooden bench beside the door, the kind of bench that looked like it had been rained on for 20 years. "Let me see if they'll let you sit inside where it's cool." "Don't you go in there alone, Frank. Stay here, I'm just going to ask. 1 minute." He helped her sit on the bench. He straightened his shirt. He took off his hat the way his father had taught him to do when entering a building. He ran his hand through his thin white hair. And he opened the door of the Iron Horseshoe Saloon and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Beer leather cigarette smoke that had been soaking into the wood and the fabric and the air for what must have been decades. The second thing he noticed was the light, or the lack of it. After the blazing afternoon outside the bar was dark as a cave, his eyes took a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw them. Men everywhere. On stools at the bar, at tables along the walls, standing in clusters near a pool table in the back. Every single one of them had turned to look at him. The conversations had stopped. The pool game had stopped. The only sound was a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, pushing the warm air around like it was stirring soup. Frank Whitfield was a Korean War veteran. He had been shot at. He had been shelled. He had carried wounded boys through frozen mud in the dark while enemy fire cracked over his head like a bullwhip. But he had not, in 81 years on this earth, felt fear like what he felt walking into that saloon. It was not the fear of physical harm. He was past caring about that. It was the fear of what would happen to Dorothy if these men said no. If they told him to get out. If they laughed at him. If they made him walk his wife back to a dead car on a burning road and sit there and wait for help that might not come for hours. There was a man at the center of the bar. He was the biggest person in the room, and the room was full of big people. His vest creaked when he breathed. The patches on it were arranged in a hierarchy that Frank did not understand but recognized as a language of rank. His beard was long and dark with streaks of gray. His forearms were thick as fence posts and covered in ink. Frank walked toward him. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of his chest like a shield that weighed nothing and protected nothing. He cleared his throat. "Can my wife rest here?" The big man's eyes moved from Frank's face down to his hands. He saw the way they shook. He saw the hat held between them. He saw something in the way this old man was standing, something that went beyond the moment, something that had to do with dignity and desperation, and the terrible courage of asking strangers for help when you are old and alone and afraid. He did not speak for a long second. Then he said, "Where is she?" Frank blinked. "Outside, sir, on the bench." The big man stood up. He was taller than Frank by a full head. His vest creaked when he moved. The patch on his chest read, "Graves," and beneath it, "President." He walked past Frank without another word. Frank followed. When Harlan Graves stepped out the front door of the Iron Horseshoe Saloon, Dorothy Whitfield looked up from the bench. She made a small sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they think the worst is about to happen, when every instinct they have says run, but their body will not allow it. Harlan stopped about 6 feet from her. He looked at her for a moment. He saw what Frank had been too close to see. He saw a woman whose skin was the wrong color. He saw lips that were nearly blue. He saw a hand pressed against a chest that was working too hard. He had seen that color before. His mother had been that color in her last years. He took off his sunglasses. He hooked them in his vest pocket. Then he crouched down slowly so that his eyes were level with hers. His knees popped like gunshots when he bent, but his face showed nothing. "Ma'am, my name is Harlan. You're going to come inside, sit in our coolest booth, and have a glass of cold water. That all right with you?" Dorothy just stared at him. She stared at the tattoos on his neck. She stared at the scars on his knuckles. She stared at the leather and the metal and the sheer physical enormity of him. And then she looked past all of it, the way a nurse looks past the surface of a person, past the presenting symptoms down to what is actually there. She looked into his eyes, and what she saw in them made her do something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood up. She did not take his hand. She did not wait for Frank. She stood up on her own 2 feet, and she walked past Harlan Graves, and she walked through the open door of the Iron Horseshoe Saloon, and she walked past the row of stunned bikers on their stools, and she walked all the way to the bar where Harlan had been sitting, and she put both hands flat on the wood, and she looked at the bartender, and she said, "My husband asked this man a question, and this man has been kind enough to say yes. Now, I would like a glass of cold water, please, and if you have any aspirin, I would appreciate that too." The bartender looked at her. He looked at Harlan, who was standing in the doorway with an expression on his face that none of his men had ever seen before. It was the expression of a man who has been impressed against his will. "Get the lady what she needs," Harlan said. The bartender moved. Harlan walked across the room. He put his hand on Dorothy's elbow gently, the way you hold something that is more valuable than anything else in the room. "Ma'am, I have a booth in the back corner with a window unit blowing right on it. Best seat in the house. Will you let me walk you over there?" Dorothy looked at him. She looked at his hand on her elbow. She looked at the tattoo of a small cross between his thumb and forefinger. "I will. Thank you, Harlan." He walked her to the booth, slowly, one step at a time, past the pool tables, past the men who stood frozen on their stools like figures in a painting, past a young man with a shaved head and haunted eyes who watched Dorothy pass with an expression that was something close to hunger. The hunger of a person who has not been spoken to with kindness in a very long time. Harlan sat her down in the booth. The window unit was blowing cold air directly onto the seat. Dorothy closed her eyes and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Frank was right behind them. He slid into the booth beside his wife. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold, which in this heat was not a good sign, but the air conditioning was already doing its work. Harlan turned to a man at the bar with a long gray beard that hung to the middle of his chest. "Stump, pitcher of ice water, 2 glasses, clean towel." Stump moved without a word. Harlan turned to another man younger with grease-blackened fingernails and a tattoo of a wrench on his forearm. "Wrench, go check on their car." "Where is it?" Frank cleared his throat. "About a half-mile back, pale blue Buick, hood still up." Wrench nodded and walked out. Harlan sat down across from Frank and Dorothy in the booth. He folded his hands on the table. Frank looked at those hands. They were the hands of a man who had hit a lot of things in his life. The knuckles were scarred and swollen with old breaks. There was a tattoo of a small cross between his thumb and forefinger on the right hand. Frank would think about that small cross later often. "Talk to me," Harlan said. "Where you headed?" Frank told him. Their daughter Elaine, 3 hours away. Dorothy's heart. The AC dying. The phone with no signal. The radiator blowing. He told it all in the plain, factual way of a man who has spent his whole life dealing with problems by describing them accurately and then doing what needs to be done. No drama, no self-pity, just the facts of 2 old people stranded on a hot road with no options. Harlan listened. He did not interrupt. Not once. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes steady, and he listened the way a person listens when they understand that listening is sometimes the first thing you owe someone. When Frank was done, Harlan turned to Dorothy. "Ma'am, when's the last time you had your medication?" "This morning." "When's the next dose?" "It's in my purse. I have it right here." She reached for her purse. Her hands were steadier now. The cold air was helping. The water was helping. The simple act of being treated like a person instead of an inconvenience was helping. She found the bottle and held it up. "You want me to get it for you?" Harlan asked. She shook her head and shook a pill into her palm. Harlan watched her. "You take that one now. I'll get you something to eat with it. You shouldn't take that on an empty stomach." Dorothy looked at him. "How do you know that?" "My mother took the same one. Different dosage. Same drug. Something passed between them." Dorothy the nurse and Harlan the son of a sick mother. A recognition, an understanding that did not need to be spoken. Harlan stood up and walked to the bar. Frank heard him say something low to the bartender. The bartender nodded and disappeared into a back room. Frank looked at Dorothy. Her cheeks had a little color coming back. Her hand was not on her chest anymore. She was sitting up straighter. "Walter," she whispered. She still called him that sometimes. the name she had used when they were courting before he became Frank to everyone, including himself. "Walter, I think we're going to be all right." Stump came over with a tray, a pitcher of ice water beaded with condensation, 2 glasses, a clean white towel folded in a perfect square. He set it down on the table with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. "Sir, ma'am." He gave them each a small nod. Then he walked back to the bar. Frank poured water for Dorothy first. She drank half a glass without stopping. Then he poured for himself. His hands were still shaking, but less now. 5 minutes later, the bartender came out with 2 plates. Hot soup, toasted bread with butter, a small dish of saltine crackers. He set them down in front of Frank and Dorothy the way a waiter sets plates down in a restaurant with care and precision, and a small step backward that said enjoy. Dorothy looked at the bread. She looked at the soup. She looked at the crackers arranged in a neat fan on the little dish. Then she looked at Frank and her eyes were wet. "Frank," she whispered. "Frank, eat your soup." Frank picked up the spoon. His hand was shaking. He put the spoon in the soup and lifted it to his mouth and tasted it, and it was the best soup he had ever had in his life, not because of what was in it, but because of where he was and who had made it possible. Across the room, Harlan Graves leaned against the bar with his arms crossed and watched the door. Not them, the door. Like he was guarding something. Like he had stationed himself between that booth and whatever might come through that entrance. Other bikers moved around the room. Each one who passed the booth in the corner glanced at the old couple eating soup. Each one gave a small nod either to Harlan or to the couple or to both. Nobody said a word about the 2 elderly people eating soup at 4 in the afternoon in the back of a biker bar in the middle of nowhere. Dorothy ate slowly. She felt the soup warm her from the inside the way the cold air was cooling her from the outside. And between the 2 forces, she felt herself coming back to center the way a compass needle settles after being spun. She noticed the young man again, the one with the shaved head and the haunted eyes. He was sitting alone at a table near the pool room, and he was not drinking. He was just sitting there staring at his hands. Dorothy looked at his hands. She looked at his wrists. She saw what she had been trained to see, what 30 years in emergency rooms had taught her to see, whether she wanted to or not. She saw the thin white lines, old scars, parallel, deliberate. His name, she would learn, was Bones. He was 28 years old. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had come home with a body that worked and a mind that did not, and he had joined the Iron Wolves because they were the only people who did not ask him why he flinched when doors slammed or why he could not sleep without the television on. Dorothy set her spoon down. She looked at Frank. "I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to talk to that young man." Frank looked at the young man in the corner. He looked at Dorothy. He knew that look. He had seen it 1,000 times. It was the look she got when she saw someone who needed help and could not ask for it. "Go ahead, Dot." She slid out of the booth. She walked across the room slowly but steadily, and she sat down across from Bones without asking permission. He looked up at her. His eyes were the color of a lake in November. Cold, deep, full of things that had sunk to the bottom and stayed there. "You were over there, weren't you?" Dorothy said. He stared at her. "My husband was in Korea, different war, same look." Bones did not speak. "I was an emergency room nurse for 30 years, Dorothy said. "I know what those scars are, and I know you don't want to talk about them, so I'm not going to ask. I'm just going to sit here with you for a minute, if that's all right." Something moved behind his eyes, a crack in the ice, a fissure that ran deep. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. She did not say anything. She just held it there, the way she had held 1,000 hands in 1,000 hospital rooms when there was nothing left to do but be present. Bones looked down at her hand on his, small, thin, veined with age. He looked at it for a long time, and then his shoulders began to shake. Not violently, not dramatically, just a tremor that started somewhere deep in his chest and worked its way outward until his whole body was involved in the effort of releasing something that had been held too long and too tight. He cried without making a sound. Dorothy held his hand and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do for someone in pain is not to fix it. It is to sit with them in it, to let them know that what they are feeling does not scare you, that you are not going to look away. Harlan watched from the bar. He had seen Bones break down before late at night alone in the parking lot. He had never seen anyone get close enough to touch it. He watched this old woman, this stranger, this person who had walked into his bar 20 minutes ago, with her hand on her chest and her life hanging by a thread, sit across from his most damaged brother, and hold his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at Frank, who was watching his wife from the booth with an expression that was equal parts pride and pain. And Harlan understood something that he had not understood before. He understood that he had not rescued these people. These people had walked into his bar and within 20 minutes had begun to rescue one of his own. Wrench came back about 30 minutes later. He walked straight to Harlan at the bar. They talked in low voices. Harlan nodded a few times. Wrench walked out again. Harlan walked over to the booth. Dorothy was back beside Frank. Bones was still sitting at his table, but his posture was different now. He was sitting up. His hands were flat on the table instead of curled into fists. Harlan slid into the booth across from Frank and Dorothy. Wrench is a mechanic. Best one I've ever known. Was a mechanic in the Army before he rode with us. He says your radiator hose blew. Easy fix. He's getting the part from his shop about 10 miles up the road. He'll have you running in about an hour and a half. He's going to replace the thermostat too, just to be safe. And he's going to take a look at that AC. Frank opened his mouth. He fumbled for his wallet. No charge, Harlan said. Sir, I have to pay you something. You don't. Eat your soup. Harlan, I can't just... Mr. Whitfield? Harlan's voice was quiet, but it had a weight to it that settled the matter the way a stone settles a tarp. You walked into a room full of strangers and asked for the smallest thing a man can ask for. You asked if your wife could sit down. I am not going to charge you for that. Not today, not ever. Frank looked down at his soup. He picked up the spoon. Dorothy squeezed his hand under the table. He ate. Outside, the afternoon was bleeding into early evening. The light through the saloon windows had turned from white to gold. The air from the window unit hummed. Frank felt Dorothy lean against him, her weight settling into his side the way it had been settling for 58 years, like water finding its level. And for one quiet minute in the back of a biker bar in the middle of nowhere, Frank Whitfield believed the worst of the day was behind them. He was wrong. The door banged open so hard it hit the wall and knocked a framed photograph to the floor. 3 men walked in. Different vests, different patches, different colors. The air in the room changed the way air changes before a storm, that sudden drop in pressure that makes your ears pop and your skin prickle. Frank felt Dorothy tense beside him. He put his arm around her. Harlan did not turn around, but every other man in that bar did. Stump set his glass down on the bar without a sound. Wrench had not come back yet. The pool game in the back room stopped. The click of balls went silent. There were 6 of Harlan's men still in the front of the bar. They all stood, not quickly, not dramatically. They just shifted from sitting to standing the way men shift when the situation requires a different posture. The 3 new men stopped just inside the door. The glass from the broken picture frame crunched under the boot of the one in front. He was tall and lean-built like a blade with a scar that pulled the right corner of his mouth down into a permanent sneer. His eyes swept the room the way a searchlight sweeps a yard. They stopped on the booth in the corner. They stopped on Dorothy. He smiled. It was not a smile. It was a showing of teeth. What's this Graves you running a nursing home now? Harlan still had his back to the door. He was facing the bar. He picked up his beer. He took a slow drink. He set it down. Get out, Cutter. The man called Cutter Voss took another step into the room. Easy now. We just came in for a drink. Didn't know you were doing community service. He looked at Dorothy again. He let his eyes move over her slowly, deliberately, the way a man looks at something he wants you to know he has noticed. Then he licked his bottom lip. Hey, Granny, you lost. Frank was up before he knew he had moved. His knees screamed. His back seized. But he was standing in front of his wife, standing between her and the man in the doorway. 81 years old, 5'8", 160 pounds, standing in front of a man who had 40 years and 50 pounds on him. You watch your mouth, Frank said. Cutter laughed. A short, sharp bark. Old man, sit down before you hurt yourself. And then Dorothy spoke. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. She spoke from the booth in the same calm, measured tone she had used 10,000 times in the emergency room when a patient was combative or a family member was hysterical or a situation was spiraling and someone needed to be the still point in the center of the chaos. I have held dying soldiers in my arms, young man. I have watched men braver than you will ever be take their last breath in my hands. You do not scare me. The bar went silent, not the silence of fear, the silence of awe. Even Cutter's two friends who had been shifting their weight and looking at each other went still. Cutter stared at her. For 1 second, something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might have been shame. Something that might have been recognition of the kind of person he was looking at. Then it was gone and the sneer was back and the moment passed. But Dorothy had bought the time that mattered, because in that 1 second of hesitation, Harlan Graves had turned around. He did not say anything yet. He just turned around slowly, like a piece of heavy machinery shifting from idle to engaged. The stool did not creak. The floor did not groan. He simply moved and the room reorganized itself around his movement the way a river reorganizes itself around a stone. He set his beer down on the bar without looking at it. He stepped away from the bar. He walked across the floor, past the pool tables, past Stump, past Bones, who had risen from his chair with something new in his eyes, something that had not been there an hour ago, past everyone, until he was standing directly between Cutter Voss and the booth where Frank was on his feet, and Dorothy was sitting with her hand pressed against her chest, not from fear, but because her heart was doing what it did when the adrenaline hit, when the rhythm stuttered, and the muscle that was supposed to pump in steady quarters began to improvise. She felt it, the familiar skip, the flutter that the cardiologist had warned her about, the arrhythmia that came with stress. She pressed her hand harder against her sternum. She breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe, slow in through the nose hold for 3, slow out through the mouth. She had coached 100 patients through this. She could coach herself. Frank was behind Harlan now. So was Dorothy. Harlan's shoulders were so wide that Frank could not see Cutter over the top of them. It was like standing behind a wall. Cutter, those two people in that booth are under my protection right now. You understand what that means. Come on, Graves. All this over some old... You already disrespected the woman once. I would not do it again. The bar got very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture. The kind of quiet you can feel on your skin. Stump stepped forward on Harlan's left. Mouth. The bartender stepped out from behind the counter on Harlan's right. 2 more men came in from the pool room. Bones stepped up behind them. 6 of Harlan's men stood in a loose semicircle, not threatening, not posturing, just present, just there. Cutter's 2 friends took half a step back toward the door. One of them had his hand on the door handle already. They knew what was happening. They could do the math. Cutter did not move. This was a man, Frank would think later, who did not understand that the hole was getting deeper around him with every second he stood there. You want to call this, Cutter said slowly, over a couple of old people eating soup. I'm not calling anything, Cutter. I'm telling you to leave. Right now. Frank watched Cutter's right hand move. Just a twitch. A small adjustment toward his hip. Harlan saw it too. Don't, Harlan said. The hand moved anyway. Cutter reached behind his belt and pulled out a folding knife. He thumbed it open with a practiced flick. The blade caught the dim bar light and threw a thin line of reflection across the ceiling. Dorothy made a small sound behind Frank. Frank reached back without turning his head and put his hand on her shoulder. He felt her trembling. Not from fear, from her heart. It was beating wrong. Harlan did not flinch. He did not reach for anything. He did not raise his voice. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and he looked at the knife the way a man looks at a child holding a toy. Cutter. What? Look around. Cutter looked. 6 men, plus Harlan, all standing, all silent, and all watching him with the patient, focused attention of men who had been in rooms like this before and knew exactly how rooms like this ended. 2 of his own behind him, one with his hand on the door ready to leave him. Cutter's eyes went tight at the corners. He still had the knife open. The blade trembled slightly in his grip. You know what's behind me, Cutter, Harlan said. His voice was low now, conversational, almost gentle. An 81-year-old man. He served in Korea. You ever served anywhere, Cutter? Silence. No, I didn't think so. His wife is 79. She has a heart condition. She is sitting in that booth right now having an episode because you walked in here on a hot afternoon and you opened your mouth at a sick woman. In my bar. It's not your bar, Graves. It is today. Harlan took one step forward. One step. The floor groaned under his weight. Cutter took half a step back and then caught himself and stopped. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had seen it. The half step, the retreat, the beginning of the end. Now I'm going to give you a choice, Harlan said. You close that knife, you walk out that door. You and your two friends get on your bikes and you ride west until you can't see this place in your mirrors anymore. And we forget this happened. He paused. He let the word or sit in the air like smoke. He let it hang there and expand and fill the space between them. Cutter's friends were already at the door. One of them pushed it open. Sunlight spilled across the floor. Cutter swallowed. The movement was visible in his throat. He folded the knife. He slid it into his back pocket. He looked at Harlan with a smile that had nothing happy in it, nothing human in it, just the reflex of a man who needed to leave the room with something that looked like dignity. We'll see each other again, Graves. We won't. Cutter turned. He walked out. His two friends followed. The door closed behind them, cutting off the sunlight, returning the bar to its cave darkness. Nobody moved for a 5 count. Then Stump exhaled and said something under his breath. Then the bartender went back behind the counter. Then the men drifted back to their stools and their tables, and the pool game resumed in the back room, and the world returned to something resembling normal. But it was not normal. Not for Frank, not for Dorothy. Harlan turned around. He looked at Frank. He looked past Frank to the booth. Dorothy was leaning back against the seat with her eyes closed. Her hand was on her chest. Her breathing was too fast. Harlan moved to the booth. He did not sit down. He knelt beside it on one knee so that his eyes were level with hers. The floor creaked under his weight. His vest creaked. His knees popped. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Dorothy opened her eyes. They were wet, but she was not crying from fear. She was crying from something else, something that Frank recognized because he had seen it before in the faces of patients who had been told the worst was over. Relief, pure unbearable relief. "I am so sorry," Harlan said. "That should not have happened. Not to you, not anywhere, not ever." Dorothy reached out and put her hand on Harlan's cheek. She did not say anything. She just held it there, her small hand against his rough face, and for a moment the entire room disappeared, and it was just the two of them. A dying woman and a broken man, and the thing that passed between them was older than language and stronger than fear. Harlan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. And Frank Whitfield, watching this enormous man kneel before his wife, felt something he had not felt in a long, long time. He felt safe. Harlan stood up. He brushed off his knee. He looked at Frank with an expression that was something between an apology and a promise, and he said, "I want to tell you both something, but first let me check on your car." He walked outside. Frank heard the low rumble of a motorcycle starting and then fading down the road. Dorothy leaned her head against Frank's shoulder. Her breathing had slowed. Her hand had come down from her chest. The arrhythmia had passed the way it always passed, leaving behind a tiredness that went all the way to the bone. "I want to go home," she whispered. "We're going to get there, Dot. We're going to get to Elaine's. No, I mean home, our home, the house on Birch Street. I want to sit on our porch and listen to the birds." Frank kissed the top of her head. Her hair smelled like the lavender shampoo she had used for 40 years. "We'll get there, honey, one thing at a time." Stump refilled their water glasses without being asked. The bartender brought out 2 slices of pie. Cherry, the kind with the lattice crust on top. Dorothy ate 3 bites and said it was the best pie she had ever tasted, which Frank knew was a lie, because Dorothy's own cherry pie was legendary in 3 counties. But she said it anyway because she was Dorothy, and Dorothy had never let truth get in the way of kindness. Bones came over to the booth. He stood at the edge of the table with his hands behind his back like a soldier reporting for duty, which in a way he was. "Ma'am," Dorothy looked up at him. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did earlier, for sitting with me. Nobody's done that before, not like that." Dorothy smiled. It was the first real smile Frank had seen on her face since the car broke down. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "They call me Bones." "What does your mother call you?" He blinked. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Marcus. She called me Marcus." "Marcus, that's a good name. Will you do something for me?" Anything, ma'am. When you get a chance, when the time is right, I want you to talk to someone, a professional, someone who knows about the things you've been carrying. Will you do that? Bones looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the thin white scars on his wrists that this old woman had seen from across a barroom. Yes, ma'am, I will. Good. Now sit down and have some pie. He sat down. He ate pie. Frank watched his wife talk to this young man the way she had talked to frightened patients in the emergency room for 3 decades. Calm, direct, without pity, with absolute respect for the person in front of her, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from or what they had done. Frank had fallen in love with Dorothy for many reasons over many years, but he fell in love with her again in that moment, watching her feed pie to a broken soldier in the back of a biker bar. Harlan came back 20 minutes later. He walked in through the door and went straight to the booth. He slid in across from them. Wrench has got your car about half done. New radiator hose, new thermostat. He's putting in new belts while he's at it because the old ones were about to go. And he got the AC running. Said it was just a relay. 40-cent part. Harlan shook his head. You'll have cold air the whole way. Frank reached for his wallet again. He could not help it. He was a man who had worked for the United States Postal Service for 34 years and had never once taken something he did not pay for. Harlan put his hand flat on the table. Sir, if you take that wallet out one more time, I'm going to be personally offended. Frank put the wallet back. Harlan looked at his hands on the table, the scarred knuckles, the small cross between his thumb and finger. He turned them over and looked at his palms, which were calloused and lined, and told a story of their own. I said I wanted to tell you both something. Frank nodded. Dorothy sat up a little straighter. My father was a man kind of like you, sir, Harlan said, looking at Frank. Worked his whole life, Korea same as you. Came home, raised a family. Quiet man, big hands, liked to fix things around the house. Never could sit still. Frank nodded again. He knew the type. He was the type. When I was 11 years old, my dad and my mom and me stopped at a gas station out in West Texas. Middle of nowhere, just a pump and a counter and a restroom with a door that didn't lock. There were 3 men there, on bikes. Not like ours. Different kind. They didn't like my dad. I don't even know why. Maybe just because he was an easy mark. Maybe because he was a quiet man with a wife and a kid, and he looked like someone who wouldn't fight back. The bar was silent around them. Stump was listening from his stool. Bones was listening from across the room. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses. They started talking to my mother, same kind of stuff that man just said to your wife. Same kind of looks. Same slow eyes up and down. My mother's name was Ruth. She was a school teacher. She was 5'3", and she weighed 110 pounds, and she had never been spoken to like that in her life. Harlan's voice was steady, but his hands had tightened on the table. My dad got between them. He told them to stop. They didn't stop. One of them hit my dad in the face. My dad went down. He got back up. They hit him again, and again, and again. He paused. I watched 4 grown men beat my father in a gas station parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon. I was 11 years old. I stood by the car and I watched. And you know what else I watched? Frank was not breathing. I watched 3 other cars pull up to that gas station while it was happening. I watched the drivers look at what was going on, and I watched every single one of them put their cars in reverse and drive away. Every one. Not one person stopped. Not one person got out. Not one person so much as honked a horn. Dorothy put her hand on the table. She did not reach for Harlan's hand. She just put hers there close available. My dad was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Broken jaw, broken ribs, broken hand. He healed, mostly. He never stood quite as straight after that. He never looked people in the eye the same way. Harlan looked at Dorothy. But my mother was the one who really got hurt that day. Not a mark on her body. Nobody touched her. But she watched her husband get beaten in front of her son, and she watched the whole world drive past. She never left the house the same way after that. She was afraid. Not of bikers, not of gas stations. She was afraid of people. She was afraid that the world was the kind of place where a man could be beaten in broad daylight and nobody would stop. He looked at his hands again. He turned them over, palms up, as if reading something written there that only he could see. She stopped going to the grocery store by herself. Stopped going to church. Stopped sitting on the front porch in the evenings. My dad would come home from work and find her in the bedroom with the curtains drawn. She wasn't crying, she wasn't sleeping. She was just sitting there, waiting for something bad to happen. That was her life after that day, waiting. Dorothy's breath had gone shallow. Not from her heart, from the story. She recognized it. She had seen it in the emergency room 100 times. The patient who comes in with chest pain, but the real diagnosis is grief. The body breaking down because the spirit broke first. She got sick when I was 23, Harlan said. Heart disease. Same kind as yours, ma'am. The doctor said stress was a contributing factor. I believe they were being polite. What they meant was that fear had eaten her alive from the inside out. She was afraid for 17 years. That is a long time to be afraid. He paused. He picked up a napkin from the table and folded it once, then again, his thick fingers working with a precision that seemed too delicate for their size. She died when I was 26. I was in prison at the time. Armed robbery. Stupid kid stuff. I did not get to go to her funeral. They wouldn't let me out. I sat in a cell in Huntsville and I listened to a guard tell me my mother was dead and I could not even stand at her grave and tell her I was sorry. The bar was so quiet that Frank could hear the ice shifting in the water pitcher. When I got out, I went to the cemetery. I sat by her stone for 3 hours. I told her everything I should have told her when she was alive. I told her I was sorry I wasn't there. I told her I was sorry I went to prison. I told her I was sorry I couldn't protect my father that day at the gas station. I told her a lot of things. He set the folded napkin down on the table like it was something fragile. And then I made myself a promise. Standing at that grave, I made a promise to Ruth Graves that I would spend the rest of my life being the person who stops. The person who does not drive past. The person who does not look away. She lived with that fear for 17 years. She died with it. Heart disease. Same as yours, ma'am. The doctor said stress was a contributing factor. I believe he was right. He looked up. That's why I started this club. That's why I run it the way I do. Most of these men out here, sir, are not what people think they are. They have been to wars. They have been to prisons. They have lost children. They have lost voices. They ride because the road is the only place where the noise in their heads goes quiet. And they stay together because the only people who understand them are other men like them. But every single one of them, every man in this bar, would die on the floor of this room before he let what happened to my father happen to your wife. I want you to know that. Frank could not speak. His throat was closed. His eyes were burning. He was thinking about his own father, a corn farmer in Iowa, who had never raised his voice or his hand, who had taught Frank that the measure of a man is not what he does when people are watching, but what he does when they are not. Frank's father would have stopped at that gas station. Frank knew that. He would have gotten out of the car and he would have walked over and he would have stood between those men and Jim Graves and he would have said, stop, because that was what decent people did. Dorothy reached across the table and took Harlan's hand. She held it the way she held the hands of patients who had just told her the worst thing that had ever happened to them, firmly, without flinching. What was your father's name, she asked. James Graves. And your mother, Ruth? Yes, ma'am. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Harlan with the same steady assessing gaze that she had worn for 30 years in the emergency room. Not diagnosing, not fixing, just seeing the whole person the way a good nurse sees the whole person, not just the wound, but the life around it. I want you to hear something, Harlan, and I want you to listen to me the way you listened to your mother when she was still the woman who wasn't afraid. Harlan went still. You lost your mother twice. You lost her the first time at that gas station when the fear got in. And you lost her the second time in that hospital bed when the fear finished what it started. And you have spent every day since then trying to undo it, trying to be the door, trying to be the thing that stands between people and the worst that can happen. She squeezed his hand. But I want you to know that what you did today, what you did for Frank and me, it was not just about being the door. You didn't just keep Cutter out. You let us in. You let an old woman sit down and eat soup and talk to a young man who needed someone to talk to. That's not a door, Harlan. That's something else. And your mother would have known the word for it because she was a teacher. Harlan's jaw was tight. His eyes were wet, but he did not blink. He did not look away. He sat there, and he received what Dorothy was giving him, which was not pity and was not sympathy and was not comfort. It was recognition. It was one broken person looking at another broken person and saying, I see what you have built out of what was broken, and it is good. Yes, ma'am, Harlan said. His voice was rough. I understand you. Wrench walked in through the front door. He had grease on his hands and a look on his face that was half satisfaction and half concern. He went straight to Harlan and spoke in a low voice. Frank caught the words radiator hose belts and something else. Something about tire marks on the road. Something about the trees east of the bar. Harlan's expression changed. Not dramatically. Not the way a civilian's face changes when they hear bad news. It was a military change, the kind of shift Frank recognized from Korea when a sergeant hears something on the radio and his whole body adjusts to a new level of readiness without moving a single visible muscle. He stood up. What is it? Frank asked. Wrench saw fresh tire marks on the shoulder about a quarter-mile east. Bikes, 3 of them, parked in the trees off the road. Recent, in the last 20 minutes. Dorothy looked at Frank. Frank looked at Harlan. Cutter, Harlan said. It was not a question. He didn't go west like I told him. He went east and pulled off the road. He's waiting. The bar went silent again. Every man in the room had heard. Every man in the room understood. The pool game had stopped for the second time that afternoon. Stump set his glass down and pushed away from the bar. Bones was already on his feet. Waiting for what? Frank asked. But he already knew. He had known men like Cutter in Korea. Men who lost a confrontation in front of witnesses and could not let it go. Men who waited in the cold and the dark for a chance to even the score. Men who turned their humiliation into someone else's suffering because that was the only arithmetic they knew. Waiting for you and Mrs. Whitfield to get in that car and drive out of here alone, on a mountain road with no cell signal and no witnesses. That's what he's waiting for. Dorothy's hand went to her chest. Not the arrhythmia this time, just the cold, hard understanding of what was being said. She thought about Ruth Graves. She thought about the gas station in West Texas. She thought about the 3 cars that drove past. And she thought about the fact that she and Frank were about to drive past Cutter Voss in a 1987 Buick with no one in the car but an 81-year-old man and a 79-year-old woman with a bad heart. Harlan looked at Stump. He looked at Bones. He looked at the men at the bar and the men by the pool tables and the men who had drifted in from the back room. He did not need to say anything. They were already standing. They were already moving toward the door. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment, as if the entire afternoon had been building toward this single decision, and now that the decision had arrived, there was nothing to discuss. Mr. Whitfield, Harlan said, you said your daughter's place is 3 hours from here. That's right. That's 3 hours of mountain road with blind curves and no cell signal, and a man out there who doesn't know how to take no for an answer. Frank's jaw tightened. He was a man who had spent his life solving his own problems. He had carried his own weight. He had never asked anyone for anything he could do himself. But this was not about him. This was about Dorothy. This was about the woman he had loved for 58 years and the heart that was failing inside her chest, and the road between here and safety, and the man with the knife who was sitting in the trees somewhere between the two. What are you saying, Harlan? I'm saying you're not driving that road alone today. Not on my watch. He turned to the room. Stump, Diesel, Bones, Wrench, everyone, get the bike started. We're riding. Frank blinked. Riding where? To your daughter's house. 3 hours, full escort, 4 in front, 4 behind, 4 on the flanks. Nobody touches you. Nobody gets near you. Nobody even looks at you sideways. Harlan, you don't have to do that. Sir, I do. Your wife sat down with one of my brothers today and held his hand and told him he was worth saving. My mechanic just spent 2 hours fixing your car for free because that is what we do. And there is a man sitting in the trees half a mile from here who pulled a knife on your wife in my bar. In my bar. So yes, sir, I do have to do this. And if you try to argue with me, I am going to be more offended than I was about the wallet. Frank looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Frank. After 58 years, they did not need words for this conversation either. She nodded, he nodded. And Frank Whitfield, who had not cried in front of another man since Korea, who had built his entire life on the principle that a man handles his own business who had driven 600 miles with a broken air conditioner and a sick wife because that was what you did. You kept going. You did not complain. You did not ask for help. Frank Whitfield put his face in his hands and wept. Dorothy put her arm around him. She held him the way she had always held him, without words, without conditions, with the simple physical truth of her body against his. She let him cry. She did not tell him it was all right. She did not tell him to stop. She just held him because, after 58 years, she knew that sometimes a man needs to break before he can be put back together. Harlan waited. He stood at the edge of the booth with his hands at his sides, and he waited for the old man to finish, and he did not look away, and he did not look uncomfortable because Harlan Graves had seen enough of the world to know that tears are not weakness. Tears are the sound a strong man makes when the strength is no longer enough. When Frank lifted his head, his eyes were red and his cheeks were wet, and his hands were steady for the first time all day. "Thank you," he said. "No need." Harlan helped Dorothy up. She was steady on her feet now. The medication, the food, the water, the rest, and something else. Something that had nothing to do with medicine had done their work. She was standing tall. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was up. She looked like what she was. A woman who had spent 30 years saving lives and was not going to let a man with a knife in a scar ruin her afternoon. Harlan walked her out to the Buick. The hood was closed. The engine was running. Cool air was blowing out of the vents. Wrench had fixed the AC just because it needed fixing, the same way he fixed everything, because a mechanic who sees a broken thing and does not fix it is not really a mechanic. Frank got in the driver's seat. He adjusted the mirror. He put his hands on the wheel. The leather was cool under his palms. Dorothy got in beside him. She buckled her seatbelt. She reached over and put her hand on Frank's knee the way she always did when they drove, that small point of contact that said, "I am here, I am with you, we are in this together." Harlan leaned in through the passenger window. His face filled the frame. "Ma'am, you feel any kind of trouble, any tightness in that chest, any dizziness, any shortness of breath, anything at all? You wave out the window, we pull over. You hear me?" "I hear you, Harlan. I mean it." "I know you do." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached through the window and put his hand on top of hers where it rested on Frank's knee. 3 hands stacked. A young man's scarred fist on an old woman's thin fingers on an old man's bony knee. The image lasted only a second, but it was the kind of image that burns itself into memory and stays there glowing for the rest of a person's life. Harlan stepped back. He swung a leg over his Harley. The engine caught on the first kick, a deep rolling thunder that Frank felt in his chest. One by one, 11 more bikes started. The thunder multiplied. The gravel lot vibrated. The windows of the saloon rattled in their frames. 4 bikes pulled in front of the Buick. 4 bikes fell in behind it. 4 more flanked the sides, 2 on each. Harlan was at the front, dead center, his broad back like a shield against whatever lay ahead on that road. They rolled out of the parking lot in formation. Slow, deliberate. The Buick in the center like a heart inside a ribcage of chrome and leather and rumbling steel. And down that mountain road in the soft gold light of a long summer afternoon, a pale blue 1987 Buick LeSabre drove the last 3 hours of its journey, surrounded on all sides by the most feared motorcycle club in 4 counties. They had gone about 2 miles when Frank saw them. 3 bikes parked in the tree line on the east side of the road. Cutter Voss was straddling his bike with his arms crossed, watching the road. His 2 friends were beside him, helmets off, waiting. One of them was smoking a cigarette. The other was leaning against a tree with his hands in his pockets. They looked like men who had been waiting for a long time and had expected to wait longer. They looked like men who had expected to see one old Buick come around that bend alone, vulnerable, easy. What they saw instead was a wall. The formation did not slow down. It did not speed up. It just kept rolling, steady and inevitable. 12 motorcycles and 1 old car coming around the bend like a procession of thunder. The sound hit them first. The deep, reverberating growl of 12 Harley engines running in formation, a sound that travels through the ground before it reaches the ears, a sound that you feel in your ribs before you hear it in your head. Cutter saw them. Frank watched his face change. Even from inside the car, even through the windshield, Frank could see the moment when Cutter Voss understood that his plan, whatever it had been, was over. The cigarette fell from his friend's hand. The other man pushed off the tree and stood straight. Cutter's arms uncrossed, His hands dropped to his sides. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. The formation was too big. The men were too many. The message was too clear. Harlan raised his left hand as they passed. Not a wave, not a threat, just a hand raised in the air, forward, the way a man holds up a hand to say stop, to say enough, to say this is the line and you are not crossing it, to say I told you to go west and you went east, and now you are looking at the consequence of that choice. Cutter did not move. His two friends did not move. They sat on their bikes in the tree line, and they watched the formation roll past bike after bike after bike, and the sound of 12 Harleys shook the leaves off the trees around them and blew the dust off the road and rattled the loose chain on Cutter's front wheel. Frank kept his eyes forward. His hands were steady on the wheel. Dorothy turned in her seat and looked back through the rear window. She watched Cutter Voss get smaller and smaller until the road curved and the trees swallowed him, and he was gone. "He's not coming," she said. "No," Frank said. "He's not." She turned back around. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at the broad back of Harlan Graves on the bike in front of them, steady as a mountain, immovable as stone. And she said something that Frank would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You know, Frank, I've been afraid of a lot of things these past few months. The diagnosis, the surgery I didn't have, leaving you alone. But I was never afraid of strangers. My mother used to say that strangers are just family you haven't met yet. I always thought that was naive. I don't think so anymore." Frank reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he had held it for 58 years, loosely, gently, with the relaxed grip of a man who knows that the thing he is holding is not going anywhere. They drove for 3 hours through the mountains. The road unwound before them like a ribbon. The light changed from gold to amber to the deep burning orange of a summer sunset. Dorothy watched the bikers through the windows. She watched the way they rode, the discipline of it, the way each man held his position relative to the car, with a precision that spoke of practice and purpose. She thought about what Harlan had said about his men: wars, prisons, lost children, lost wives. She thought about the emergency room. She thought about the nights when a man would come in with injuries that told one story and eyes that told another, and she would clean the wound and bandage the cut and give him a cup of coffee, and sometimes that cup of coffee was the only kindness he had received in months. She thought about Bones, Marcus, the scars on his wrists, the way he had cried without making a sound, as though he had learned long ago that making a sound was not permitted. She thought about the letter she would write to him. She did not know yet that she would write to him, but the seed of it was there, already planted in that moment at the table, watered by the pie and the tears and the silence that had passed between them. Frank drove with both hands on the wheel the way he tried. He always drove at 10 and 2, the way his instructor had taught him at Fort Riley in 1962. He was not a fast driver. He was not a slow driver. He was a careful driver, the kind of driver who checks his mirrors every 12 seconds and signals his turns 300 feet before the intersection. The bikers adjusted their speed to his without complaint or impatience. They rode at his pace because his pace was Dorothy's pace, and Dorothy's pace was the only pace that mattered. Trucks they passed slowed down to look at the formation. A family in a station wagon pulled over to the shoulder, and the children pressed their faces to the windows and pointed. A state trooper at a speed trap watched them go by. He sat in his cruiser for a long minute, and then he keyed his radio and asked his sergeant what in the name of God he had just seen. At one point, Dorothy fell asleep. Her head tilted against the window, and her breathing evened out, and her hand relaxed on Frank's knee. Frank glanced at her. Her color was good. Her lips were pink. The AC was blowing cold air across her face and ruffling the thin white hair at her temples. She looked peaceful. She looked like the girl he had married in 1966 at the First Presbyterian Church on Elm Street. The girl who had worn a dress she sewed herself because they could not afford one from a store. The girl who had looked at him across the altar and whispered, "I'm going to take such good care of you, Frank," and had kept that promise every single day for 58 years. He blinked hard and watched the road. When they crossed the county line into Tennessee, Harlan turned his head slightly and raised 2 fingers. The formation tightened. The flanking bikes moved closer to the car. Frank did not know what the signal meant, but he felt the change in the air, the subtle increase in attention like an animal whose ears have pricked up. Nothing happened. The road was clear. The mountains gave way to rolling hills, and the hills gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to the outskirts of the small town where Elaine lived with Tom and the boys. But the formation did not relax until Harlan signaled again, a flat hand palm down, which apparently meant safe. At every intersection, two bikes would pull ahead and block the cross traffic until the Buick passed. At every curve, the flanking bikes would fan out to check the blind spots. It was a military escort, precise and disciplined, and Frank, who had served with the Army in Korea, recognized the quality of it. These men knew how to move together. They knew how to protect something that was worth protecting. And right now, the thing they were protecting was an old woman sleeping against a car window with her hand on her husband's knee. The sun was touching the horizon when they turned onto the road that led to Elaine's house. The bike slowed to 25 miles an hour out of respect for the neighborhood. They eased down the lane. They passed houses where people came out onto their porches to watch. They passed a woman walking a dog who stopped in the middle of the sidewalk with her mouth open. They stopped in front of a small white house with a porch swing and a basketball hoop in the driveway and a garden full of marigolds that Elaine had planted in the spring. Elaine Whitfield came out the front door. So did her husband, Tom. So did their two teenage boys, Michael and David, who stood on the porch steps in their bare feet and stared at 12 motorcycles idling in front of their house like they were watching a movie that had accidentally become real. Dorothy woke up when the engine dropped to idle. She blinked. She looked through the windshield at her daughter's house, at the marigolds, at the basketball hoop, at the porch swing, where she had sat last summer and the summer before that and every summer she could remember. She looked at Elaine on the porch. Elaine was 46 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and she was standing with both hands pressed against her cheeks in an expression that was equal parts terror and bewilderment. Tom had his hand on Elaine's shoulder. Tom was a high school English teacher who coached junior varsity basketball and volunteered at the food bank on Saturdays. He was a quiet man, the kind of man who reads poetry alone in his office during lunch and does not tell anyone about it. He was looking at the motorcycles the way he looked at a poem he had not yet understood, with careful attention and no judgment. Michael, 17, tall and thin, with the beginnings of a beard he was very proud of, and a report card he was not, stood on the top step with his arms crossed. He had been difficult lately. Not bad, not dangerous, just lost the way 17-year-old boys get lost when the world they are about to enter looks nothing like the world they were promised. He had been skipping class. He had been staying out late. He had been picking fights with Tom about things that were not really about the things they were fighting about. Elaine had called Dorothy 3 weeks ago crying, saying she did not know how to reach him anymore. David, 14, stood one step behind his brother. He was the quiet one, the observer, the boy who noticed everything and said nothing. He was watching the bikers with wide eyes and a slightly open mouth. Harlan got off his bike. He pulled off his gloves. He tucked them into his belt. He walked over to the driver's side window. Frank rolled it down. Harlan reached in. He took Frank's hand. He shook it once firm, the way men shake hands when the handshake is not a greeting, but a covenant. "Sir, it has been an honor." Frank tried to say something. His mouth opened and nothing came out. He squeezed Harlan's hand harder instead. Two men who had been to war. Two men who understood that some things cannot be said and do not need to be. Then Harlan walked around to the passenger side. He bent down. He took Dorothy's hand. He lifted it to his lips and kissed the back of it gently, the way a man kisses the hand of a person he holds in the highest regard. "Ma'am?" "Harlan." She held his hand for a moment longer than necessary. She looked into his eyes. And she said the thing she had been thinking about for the last 3 hours on that mountain road, the thing that had been forming in her mind like a sentence she had been working on her whole life. "You told me you made yourself a promise to be the door, Harlan. The barrier between people and the ones who would hurt them." "Yes, ma'am." "You're not the door, Harlan. You're the bridge. You're the thing that connects people who have no reason to know each other. You're the reason Frank and I are going to sleep in our daughter's house tonight instead of on the side of a road. That's not a door. That's a bridge, and bridges go both ways." Harlan looked at her. He looked at this 79-year-old woman with the bad heart and the steady eyes and the 30 years of emergency room wisdom, and he did not speak for a long moment. Something moved behind his face, something deep and old and permanent, like a foundation shifting after decades of bearing weight it was never designed to hold. Then he reached inside his vest. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Frank. "That's my number. Anywhere in this country, any time of day, any reason at all. You call me, we come. He stepped back. He looked at the porch. He looked at Elaine and Tom and the boys. He gave them a small nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he wants you to know that he means no harm, that he was just passing through, that the world is sometimes stranger and kinder than you thought it was. He swung a leg over his Harley. The engine caught on the first kick, a deep rolling thunder that Frank felt in his chest. One by one, 11 more bikes started. The thunder multiplied. The windows of the house rattled in their frames. He nodded to his crew. 12 Harleys turned in the lane and rolled back out the way they had come, single file. Now a long line of thunder that faded into the dusk until the sound was gone and the street was quiet, and the only evidence that any of it had happened was the faint smell of exhaust and the folded piece of paper in Frank Whitfield's hand. Elaine came down off the porch. She was crying. She did not know why she was crying. She would not know the full story until later that evening, when Frank and Dorothy sat at her kitchen table and told her everything from the smoke on the highway to the soup in the booth, to the knife in Cutter's hand, to the 3 hands stacked on Frank's knee. She would cry again, then harder. But those tears would be different. Those tears would have a name. Tom helped Dorothy out of the car. He held her arm the way Frank held her arm, gently, respectfully, with the careful attention of a man who understands that the people we love are not permanent. Michael and David were still on the porch. Michael had uncrossed his arms. His face had changed. The sullenness was gone. The teenage armor was gone. In its place was something raw and open and confused, the face of a boy who has just seen something that does not fit into any of the categories he has built for understanding the world. He turned to his grandfather and said, "Grandpa, who were those guys?" Frank looked at his grandson. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. He looked at Dorothy, who was climbing the porch steps on her own 2 feet with Elaine on one side and Tom on the other, steady, strong, alive. "Those," Frank said, "are the best men I have ever met." Michael looked at the empty road. He looked at the fading light. He looked at his grandfather's face, which was wet and tired and somehow more alive than Michael had ever seen it. And something shifted inside that boy, something small and quiet, like a compass needle finding north for the first time. He would not understand what it was until much later. But it was there. It had been planted, and it would grow. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and the house was quiet except for the sound of crickets, through the screen door, Dorothy sat at Elaine's kitchen table and told the story. She told it from the beginning, not from the bar, from the morning, from the moment she opened her eyes at 5:15 in Janet's guest bedroom and lay in the gray light and listened to Frank breathe. She told Elaine about the diagnosis, about the surgery she had declined, about the cardiologist and the numbers, and the decision she had made 4 months ago, and told no one. Elaine sat across from her with her hand over her mouth and tears running down her face, and she did not interrupt because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that the most important thing you can do when someone is telling you something hard is to let them finish. Frank sat beside Dorothy. He was hearing some of this for the first time. The surgery, the odds, the choice. He sat there and he listened, and he felt the ground shift beneath him. Not violently, not like an earthquake, but slowly, like the settling of a foundation that has been holding the weight for a long time and has just been told the weight is going to increase. When Dorothy finished, Elaine got up from the table. She walked around to her mother's side. She knelt down beside the chair the way Harlan had knelt beside the booth in the bar, and she put her arms around her mother and held her. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. There was only the holding and the being held, and the kitchen clock ticking on the wall. Tom stood in the doorway. He had been listening from the hallway. His eyes were red. He was holding a dish towel in both hands and wringing it like a rope, the way a man wrings something when his hands need to be busy and his heart needs to be still. "Mom," Elaine said into her mother's shoulder, "why didn't you tell us?" "Because you would have tried to change my mind, and my mind is made up." "We could have." "No, you couldn't have. And I didn't want to spend the time I have left arguing about how to spend it. I wanted to spend it being with you, with your father, with the boys. That's what I'm doing. That's what today was about." She pulled back. She held Elaine's face in her hands. She looked at her daughter the way a mother looks at a child who is about to learn something painful with love and sorrow, and the particular helplessness of a parent who cannot protect their child from the one thing that is going to hurt the most. I'm going to be all right, Elaine. Not in the way you want me to be, but in the way that matters. Elaine nodded. She could not speak. Tom came over and put his hand on his wife's back. Frank sat at the table and now looked at his hands. He was thinking about the bar. He was thinking about the booth. He was thinking about the moment when Harlan had asked Dorothy about her medication, and she had answered without hesitation, and he realized now that she had been managing her own death the way she had managed everything else in her life, calmly, competently, without drama, with the same steady hands that had held dying patients and told them it was all right. He had married the strongest person he had ever known. He was only now beginning to understand how strong. Later that night, lying in the guest bedroom with the moonlight coming through the curtains and the sound of frogs in the garden, Frank reached for Dorothy's hand. "Why didn't you tell me about the surgery?" he asked. "Because you would have wanted me to have it." "Of course I would have. And I would have had it for you, not for me. And the odds were bad, Frank. 20% chance of surviving the operation. And if I survived another 2 years of recovery that would have been spent in hospitals and rehabilitation centers and doctors' offices, I didn't want that. I wanted this. This, today, the drive, the mountains, the bar, those men. Your face when Harlan said he was going to escort us. Elaine's face when we pulled into the driveway. This, the real parts of being alive, not the machines and the tubes and the beeping. The people, the hands, the soup." Frank was quiet for a long time. "I wish you had told me." "I know, I'm telling you now." He brought her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, each one the way he had kissed them on their wedding night in a motel room in Ohio that cost $4 and had a window that did not close all the way. He held her hand against his cheek, and he closed his eyes, and he did not sleep for a long time. Dorothy slept. She slept the way she always slept when she was close to Frank, deeply and without dreams, with her hand in his, and her heart doing its imperfect work, and the night doing what the night does, which is to hold everything still until the morning comes. Dorothy Whitfield lived for 4 more years. They were not easy years. The heart did what the heart was going to do, and no amount of medication or rest or cold water or careful breathing was going to change the trajectory that the cardiologist in Philadelphia had drawn on a chart and shown to a woman who already knew what it meant. But they were full years. They were years that had weight and texture and meaning, and Dorothy lived every one of them the way she had lived every day of her life, with her eyes open and her hands busy and her attention turned outward toward the people she loved and the people she had not yet met. She kept the folded piece of paper in a kitchen drawer, not hidden, not displayed, just kept the way you keep something that is too important to throw away and too personal to frame. Frank knew where it was. He checked on it, sometimes the way a man checks on a loaded gun in a lockbox. Not because he planned to use it, because knowing it was there made the world feel slightly more manageable. They went home to the house on Birch Street. Dorothy sat on the porch swing and listened to the birds the way she had told Frank she wanted to, and Frank sat beside her and read the newspaper. And did not read the newspaper because what he was actually doing is listening to his wife breathe and counting the breaths the way a man counts money carefully, because he knew the supply was not infinite. The first letter arrived at the Iron Horseshoe Saloon 6 weeks after they got home. It was addressed to Marcus, which confused the bartender because nobody at the bar went by that name. He left it on the counter. It sat there for 2 days until Bones came in on a Thursday afternoon, and Stump pointed at it and said someone had sent mail to a Marcus, and did anyone know a Marcus? Bones looked at the envelope. He recognized the handwriting. He had never seen it before, but he recognized it anyway, the way you recognize the voice of someone who once said something to you that changed the shape of your world. He opened it at the bar. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. Then he folded it and put it in his vest pocket and went outside and sat on the bench where Dorothy had sat 4 years ago. And he looked at the parking lot and the highway beyond it, and he did not move for a long time. The letter said this. It said, "Dear Marcus," it said, "I have been thinking about you since the day we met." It said, "I want you to know that the scars on your wrists tell me something about you that you may not know yet. They tell me that you survived. They tell me that there was a moment when the pain was bigger than your ability to hold it, and you did what you could with the tools you had, and then you kept going. That is not weakness. That is not failure. That is the definition of endurance." It said I was a nurse for 30 years. I have seen men come through the emergency room doors with every kind of wound a body can receive. Burns, breaks, bullets, blades. And the ones who survived, Marcus, were not the ones with the smallest wounds. They were the ones who decided in the moment when the pain was worst that they were going to keep going. You made that decision. You are making it every day. I see it in you. It said I would like to write to you if you will let me. I would like to hear about your days. I would like to know what you are reading and what you are thinking and whether you have talked to that professional I mentioned. I am an old woman with a bad heart and too much time on her hands, and if you can find it in yourself to write back to a stranger who sat with you once in a bar and held your hand, I would be grateful. It was signed Dorothy Whitfield, and beneath the signature in smaller letters, she had written a postscript. It said, I know you think you are broken. You are not broken. You are just not finished yet. Bones wrote back. His handwriting was terrible. His spelling was worse. His sentences were short and blunt, and sometimes they stopped in the middle as though the thought had run into a wall and could not get over it. But he wrote. He told her about his days. He told her about the bar and the bikes and the road. He told her about the nightmares that came when he closed his eyes and the way the sound of a car backfiring could put him on the floor with his hands over his head. He told her about the therapist he had started seeing at the VA, a woman named Dr. Hale who had a quiet office, and a dog named Chester, who sat under the desk during sessions and put his chin on your foot when the conversation got hard. He told her Chester was a good dog. He told her the therapist was helping. Dorothy wrote back. She asked about Chester. She asked about the therapist. She asked what kind of dog Chester was. She did not ask about the nightmares. She did not ask about Afghanistan. She did not ask about the scars. She asked about the things that were alive and growing, not the things that were dead and buried, because she knew from the 30 years in medicine that the fastest way to help a wound heal is not to keep looking at it, but to make sure the body around it is strong enough to do its job. The letters went back and forth for 4 years. Bones kept every one of Dorothy's in a shoebox under his bed. Dorothy kept every one of his in a drawer in her desk beside the folded piece of paper with Harlan's phone number. 2 drawers, 2 connections to the same afternoon in the same bar on the same mountain road. 2 threads that ran from that single day outward into the future like roots from a tree. Frank called Harlan once. It was February. They were at Janet's house in Pennsylvania visiting for the long weekend. The temperature was 12 degrees. Frank went out to start the Buick in the morning, and the engine turned over once and died. He tried again. Dead. He stood in the driveway in his coat, in his hat, in his boots, and he looked at the car, and he felt the old helplessness rising in his chest. The same helplessness he had felt on that mountain road. The feeling of a man who has done everything right and still finds himself standing in the cold with a problem he cannot solve. He went inside. He opened the kitchen drawer where Janet kept the odds and ends, the rubber bands and the old keys and the takeout menus from restaurants that had closed years ago. He found the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. He looked at the number. He felt foolish. He felt like a man who was about to bother someone important with something small. But he picked up the phone and he dialed. Harlan picked up on the second ring. Mr. Whitfield. Harlan, I'm sorry to bother you. I really am. It's the car. Where are you? Frank told him. Pennsylvania. Janet's house. 3 states away. The car was dead. It was 12 degrees outside. Dorothy was inside by the fire. Stay where you are, Harlan said. 2 hours. He did not ask what was wrong with the car. He did not ask if Frank had tried jumping it. He did not ask any of the questions that a normal person asks when someone calls about a dead car 3 states away. He just said 2 hours and he hung up. 2 hours and 10 minutes later, Harlan and Stump pulled into Janet's driveway on their bikes with a tow truck behind them. They had ridden 2 hours in 12-degree weather on motorcycles. Frank stood at the kitchen window and watched them pull in, and he could not believe what he was seeing. Their faces were red. Their hands were stiff. Stump's beard had frost on it. Wrench was driving the tow truck. He had the car up on the flatbed within 20 minutes and the problem diagnosed within 30. Dead battery, corroded terminals. He replaced both in Janet's driveway, lying on his back on the frozen concrete with his bare hands because the gloves were too thick to work in. Harlan came inside. He stood in Janet's kitchen in his leather vest and his big boots, and he looked around at the wallpaper, in the refrigerator magnets, in the bowl of fruit on the counter, and he looked like exactly what he was, which was a man from another world standing in a room that was not designed for him, but that was glad to have him anyway. Janet made coffee. She set a cup in front of Harlan. She set another in front of Stump. She set a plate of cookies between them. She stood at the counter and looked at these two enormous men sitting at her kitchen table, and she did not know what to say. So she said the thing that mothers say when they do not know what to say, which was, "Would you like more coffee?" Dorothy came downstairs. She was moving slowly now. The stairs were getting harder. The short walk from the bedroom to the kitchen was longer than it used to be. But she was dressed and her hair was combed, and when she saw Harlan sitting at the table, she smiled, and it was the same smile Frank had fallen in love with 60 years ago in a general store on Main Street. "Harlan." "Ma'am?" She sat down across from him. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She looked at him over the rim the way she looked at everyone, with those steady emergency room eyes that saw the surface and the thing beneath the surface and the thing beneath that. "You rode 2 hours in 12-degree weather." "Yes, ma'am." "On a motorcycle." "Yes, ma'am." "That is the most foolish and the most wonderful thing I have ever heard." Harlan smiled. It was a rare expression on his face, and it changed everything. The scars softened, the jaw relaxed, the eyes, which were usually watching and measuring and calculating distance and threat, became for a moment the eyes of a boy who had been told he did something right. Harlan stayed for 2 hours. He sat at Janet's kitchen table and he told 3 stories about the road that made Janet laugh so hard she had to hold onto the counter. He told a story about Stump getting his beard caught in a chain at a gas station in Kentucky. He told a story about the wrench rebuilding an engine in a parking lot in the rain using nothing but a socket set and a flashlight held in his teeth. He told a story about Bones, about the day Bones had walked into the bar after 3 months of therapy and said 6 words that Harlan had never expected to hear from him. Bones had said, "I think I'm going to be all right." Janet cried at that one, not the laughing kind of crying, the other kind. When Harlan stood up to leave, Dorothy asked him to wait. She went upstairs. She came back down with a small brown paper bag. She handed it to him. "What's this?" "Apple pie. I made it this morning. The crust is from scratch. The apples are from the tree in Janet's backyard." Harlan looked at the bag. He looked at Dorothy. He held the bag the way a man holds a thing he has been given that he does not deserve and did not earn and cannot repay. "Thank you, ma'am." "You come back for Thanksgiving. I'll make a whole one." He came back for Thanksgiving. He brought Stump and Bones. Dorothy made 2 pies, 1 apple, 1 cherry. Bones sat at the table and ate 3 slices and did not say much, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to the elbows and the scars on his wrists were visible, and he did not try to hide them. Dorothy noticed. She did not say anything about it. She just put another slice on his plate. Michael was there. He sat across from Harlan at the Thanksgiving table and stared at him the way a boy stares at something he cannot categorize, something that does not fit into any of the boxes the world has given him. Michael had been angry for a year. Angry at school, angry at Tom, angry at the smallness of his life and the bigness of his confusion and the gap between who he was supposed to be and who he actually was. He had been picking fights and skipping class and staying out past curfew and doing all the small, stupid things that boys do when they are trying to feel something other than lost. But he had not been able to stop thinking about the motorcycles, about the sound they made coming down the lane, about his grandfather's face wet and alive saying, "Those are the best men I have ever met," about the piece of paper in the kitchen drawer that meant someone somewhere would come if you called. After dinner, while the adults were in the kitchen doing dishes and arguing about football, Michael went outside. He sat on the porch steps. He was looking at the bikes in the driveway when the screen door opened and Harlan came out. He sat down beside Michael. The porch step groaned under his weight. He did not say anything. He just sat there the way Dorothy had sat with Bones in the bar, without agenda, without expectation, just present. Michael looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you do it that day with my grandparents? Why did you help them? You didn't know them." Harlan looked at the driveway. He looked at the bikes. He looked at the street, which was empty and dark and quiet. "Because I knew what would happen if I didn't." "What would happen?" "I would have become one of the people who drove past." Michael did not understand, not yet. But the words went into him the way a seed goes into soil, silently and visibly, and he would carry them for years before they bloomed. Your grandfather is one of the bravest men I have ever met, Harlan said. Not because he fought in Korea, because he walked into a room full of men he was afraid of, and he asked for help. That is the hardest thing a man can do, Michael. It is harder than fighting. It is harder than being tough. It is harder than anything. Asking for help when you need it and accepting it when it comes. Michael looked at his hands. You're struggling, Harlan said. It was not a question. Your grandmother told me. She worries about you. She told you about me. She tells me about everyone she loves. That's how I know she loves you. Michael was quiet for a long time. The crickets sang in the garden. A car passed on the distant highway, its headlights sweeping across the trees. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Michael said. With my life, with anything. Nothing makes sense. It's not supposed to make sense at 17. It's supposed to be confusing. The trick is not to let the confusion turn into anger. Anger is easy. Confusion is hard. Sitting with the confusion and letting it teach you something, that is the hardest thing of all. Michael looked at him. Did you sit with it? No, I turned mine into anger. I turned it into fists and bad decisions in a prison cell. I am telling you what I wish someone had told me. They sat on the porch for an hour. Harlan told Michael about the road, about the club, about the men who rode with him and what they had survived and what they had lost and what they had found on the other side of losing it. He did not romanticize anything. He did not make the biker life sound glamorous or exciting. He made it sound like what it was, a last resort for men who had no other way to belong. You have a family, Harlan said. You have a mother and a father and a brother and grandparents who drove 600 miles in a broken car to see you. You have something I didn't have. Don't throw it away because you're confused. The confusion passes. The family doesn't. When they went inside, Michael hugged his grandmother. He held on longer than usual. Dorothy looked over his shoulder at Harlan, who was standing by the door with his hands in his pockets, and she smiled. The smallest smile, the kind that passes between two people who understand that they have just done something important without planning to. That was the night of the dinner. It was late, the dishes were done, Janet and her husband had gone to bed. Frank was dozing in the living room with the television on low. The house was quiet in the way that houses get late at night when the cooking is over and the guests are still there, and the conversation has moved from the things you talk about in front of everyone to the things you only say when the room is emptied and the hour is soft. Dorothy and Harlan were sitting at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee between them, the fluorescent light humming above, the smell of pie still in the air. I want to ask you something, Dorothy said. Anything, ma'am? Tell me about your mother. Not the gas station, not the fear. Tell me about her before all that. Tell me about Ruth when she was still Ruth. Harlan was quiet for a long time. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The cup looked small in his grip, a child's teacup in a giant's fingers. She made biscuits on Sunday mornings, he said, real biscuits. From scratch, she'd get up before anyone else in the house, and I'd hear her in the kitchen, the sound of the rolling pin on the counter. She hummed while she cooked. She couldn't carry a tune to save her life, but she hummed anyway. Hymns mostly. Sometimes Patsy Cline. Dorothy smiled. She read to me every night, every single night, even when I was too old for it. Even when I was 12 and 13, and I told her I didn't need it anymore. She'd come to my door and she'd say one chapter and I'd say fine, and she'd read one chapter and then she'd close the book and she'd kiss my forehead and she'd say, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, every single night. His voice had changed. It was softer now, lower. The voice of a man who has gone back to a room he has not visited in a very long time and found that everything in it is exactly where he left it. The last time I saw her, I was being led out of a courtroom in handcuffs. She was sitting in the gallery. She didn't cry. She just looked at me, and she mouthed 2 words. Be good. He set the cup down. I wasn't good, ma'am, not for a long time, but I'm trying. Dorothy reached across the table. She put her hand on his. Harlan, I want you to listen to me. I have been thinking about your mother for 4 years, about what happened to her, about the fear that killed her, and I want to tell you something that I think she would want you to know. He looked at her. His eyes were wet but steady. Every time you stop for someone, Every time you get between a stranger and the thing that would hurt them. Every time you fix a key or hold a hand or ride 2 hours in the cold because an old man's battery died. You are not just keeping your promise. You are undoing what happened at that gas station. You are proving that the world your mother was afraid of does not have to exist. You are building a different one, and your mother, wherever she is, can see that. She can see the world you are building. And in that world, Harlan, she is not afraid anymore. Harlan looked down at the table. A single tear ran down his right cheek and disappeared into his beard. He did not wipe it. He let it go. Every time you help a stranger, Dorothy said, you are going to your mother's funeral. You are standing at her grave and saying the things you didn't get to say. You are laying flowers. You are saying goodbye. Do you understand that? Harlan nodded. He could not speak. You don't have to carry that guilt anymore, sweetheart. She forgave you the moment they put the handcuffs on. I know that because I'm a mother and that's what mothers do. Harlan put his head down on the table. His shoulders shook. Dorothy held his hand and let him cry the way she had let Bones cry in the bar 4 years ago, without flinching, without looking away, without any sound except the quiet hum of the fluorescent light and the distant murmur of the television in the next room where Frank was sleeping in his chair. When Harlan lifted his head, his eyes were red and his face was wet, and he was looking at Dorothy with an expression that Frank, had he been awake to see, it would have recognized. It was the expression of a man who has been healed. Not fixed, not repaired, healed. The way a wound heals from the inside out, leaving a scar that is stronger than the skin it replaced. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, just keep building. Dorothy began to slow down in the spring of her 83rd year. The walks got shorter, the stairs got harder, the naps got longer. The doctor in Philadelphia adjusted her medication twice in March and once in April. And each time, Dorothy nodded and took the new pills and did not complain and did not mention the surgery she had declined 4 years ago. She had moved in with Elaine by then. Frank and Dorothy both had. The house on Birch Street was too big for two old people, too many stairs, too many rooms that echoed with the absence of the life that had once filled them. Elaine had converted the downstairs den into a bedroom so Dorothy would not have to climb stairs. Frank slept beside her in a hospital bed that the insurance company had delivered and that Dorothy had insisted on pushing against the wall so it looked less like a hospital bed and more like a piece of furniture. She still got up early. She still sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she no longer drank. She still watched the light come through the window and change the room from gray to gold. But she moved more slowly now, and the distances between things had grown, and the world that had once been within reach was retreating step by step the way the tide retreats quietly, inevitably leaving the sand exposed. She wrote letters. Not just to Bones, she wrote to everyone. She wrote to Janet. She wrote to Elaine. She wrote to Michael, who was now 21 and had enrolled in community college and was studying criminal justice and had stopped fighting with Tom and had started volunteering at a youth center on weekends working with boys who reminded him of himself at 17, angry and lost and looking for something to hit. She wrote to David, who was 18 and quiet and kind and had his grandmother's eyes and was going to study nursing, a decision that had made Dorothy cry at the kitchen table when he told her not from sadness, but from the particular joy of seeing something you love continue in someone you love more. She wrote to Frank. She wrote to Harlan. She did not tell anyone she was writing these letters. She wrote them in the early mornings at the kitchen table with that cup of coffee warming her hands. She wrote slowly. Her handwriting was still clear, still precise, still the handwriting of a nurse who had spent decades writing notes that needed to be read correctly because lives depended on it. But the letters took longer now. Her hand tired more quickly. She would write a paragraph and rest, write another paragraph and rest. The resting was getting longer than the writing. She sealed each letter in an envelope. She wrote each name on the front in her careful hand. She put them in the drawer of her desk next to the letters from Bones and the folded piece of paper with Harlan's number. 3 things in one drawer. 3 threads from one afternoon. The letter to Frank was the longest, 4 pages front and back. She wrote it over 3 mornings, and when she sealed it, she held the envelope against her chest for a moment, pressing it against the heart that was failing, as though the warmth of her body could transfer something to the paper that words could not carry. The letter to Harlan was the one that took the most care. She wrote it and rewrote it and wrote it again. Not because the words were hard to find, because they were too easy, because what she wanted to say was so simple and so true that she was afraid of getting it wrong the way a surgeon is most careful with the simplest cut, because the simple ones are the ones that matter most. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Frank woke up at 5:30 and reached for Dorothy's hand, the way he reached for it every morning, the way he had reached for it for 58 years, the automatic gesture of a man whose body knows what it needs before his mind is fully awake. Her hand was there. It was cool, not cold, just cool the way skin gets when the blood has stopped moving through it, when the heart has finally finished its imperfect work and laid down the burden it has been carrying. He knew. He knew before he opened his eyes. He knew because he had been listening to her breathe for 58 years, and the silence was louder than any sound he had ever heard. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of completion. The silence of a sentence that has reached its period. The silence of a woman who had done everything she set out to do and had done it well. He lay there for a long time. He held her hand. He did not call anyone. He did not get up. He just lay there in the gray light of an April morning and held the hand of the woman who had sold flowers in a general store on Main Street and who had said, "I'm going to take such good care of you, Frank," and who had kept that promise every single day until the last one. He thought about the morning she walked into that bar. He thought about the way she had walked past Harlan and past the bikers and put her hands on the bar and asked for a glass of water. He thought about the way she had sat down with Bones and held his hand without being asked. He thought about the bridge. He thought about what she had said to him in the car, that strangers are just family you haven't met yet, and how she had spent her whole life proving it. When the light came through the window and turned the room from gray to gold, Frank kissed Dorothy's forehead. He smoothed her hair. He straightened the collar of her nightgown, the blue one with the small white flowers, her favorite, the one she had been wearing the day they met at Pemberton's general store when she was 19, and the flowers on her dress were real and pinned to her collar because she worked in a flower shop and she always wore what she sold. He got up. He walked to the phone. He called Elaine. Elaine answered and heard nothing but silence, and then her father's voice, broken and small, saying the words that she had been dreading for 4 years. The words that daughters begin dreading the moment they are old enough to understand that mothers are not permanent. Then Frank opened the kitchen drawer. He took out the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. He looked at the number through eyes that were blurred with tears. He dialed. Harlan picked up on the first ring, not the second, the first, as though he had been waiting, as though some part of him had known the way animals know before an earthquake, the way soldiers know before the shelling starts, that the call was coming and that when it came, he would need to be ready. Frank did not have to say anything. Harlan heard the silence. He heard the quality of it, the specific gravity of a silence that contains a death. He had heard that silence before. He had heard it in a prison cell when a guard told him his mother was gone. When and where, sir? The funeral was on a Saturday. It was held at the First Methodist Church in the small town where Frank and Dorothy had lived for 43 years. The church seated about 200 people. It was full that morning. Family filled the first 3 rows. Old neighbors who had borrowed sugar and returned it with cookies. Women from Dorothy's book club who had read 30 years of novels together and debated endings over glasses of wine that turned into bottles. Patients she had nursed decades ago, who had driven hours to be there, men and women who remembered the calm voice and the steady hands that had held them when they were at their worst, and told them they were going to be all right even when the numbers on the machine said otherwise. The doctors and nurses from Mercy General, who had worked beside her for 30 years, and who had learned from her that medicine is not just science, but presence, not just skill, but attention, not just treatment, but the simple, radical act of looking at a suffering person and saying, "I see you and I am not leaving." The flowers were marigolds. Elaine had insisted, not lilies, not roses. Marigolds because Dorothy had planted them in Elaine's garden every spring, and because marigolds are the flowers that bloom longest and brightest and refuse to quit it even when the summer is ending and the other flowers have given up. That was Dorothy, a marigold, tough and bright and still blooming in September when everything else had gone to seed. And in the back of the church, standing along the wall because they had refused to sit in pews they thought they did not deserve, were 9 men in black leather vests over white dress shirts. Harlan in the middle, Stump on his right, Wrench on his left. Bones beside Wrench standing straight, standing tall, standing the way a man stands when he wants the world to see that he is no longer broken. 5 more men who Frank had not met before, men who had heard the story over the years, men who had heard about the old woman who walked into a biker bar and sat down with a broken soldier and held his hand and told him he was not finished yet. They had come because the story had become their story too, because Dorothy had become their Dorothy too, because some people are so large in their kindness that they belong to everyone who has ever been touched by them, even people who have never met them, even people who only know them through the words of a man who loved them. They stood at attention, not military attention, something else, something that was their own that they had invented for themselves, a way of standing that said, "We are here and we are not leaving, and we do not know the songs, but we will stand for every one of them." The organ played, the hymns rose and fell, the sunlight came through the stained glass windows and painted the floor in colors that moved slowly across the wood as the morning advanced, blue and gold, and red, the colors of something sacred. Frank walked back during the opening hymn. He walked down the center aisle past 200 people who were singing and crying and holding hymnals they could barely see through their tears. He walked to the back wall. He took Harlan by the hand. "Come with me," he said. "Sir, we're fine back here." "Harlan, come with me." He led Harlan up the aisle, Caparnia. Behind them, one by one, the other 8 men peeled off the wall and followed. They walked in single file past the pews, past the flowers, past the photograph of Dorothy on the altar table, the one from her nursing school graduation, where she was 22, and her smile was so wide it seemed to take up the whole frame. Frank sat Harlan in the front pew, right next to Elaine, right next to Janet, right next to Frank himself. The other 8 men filled the rest of the row and spilled into the row behind. Stump was crying. He was trying not to. He was failing. When it came time for the eulogies, Elaine spoke first, then Janet, then Tom, who read a poem that he had written the night before in his office with the door closed, a poem about marigolds and porch swings and the sound of a mother's voice calling children home from the yard at dusk. Then Frank stood up. He walked to the front. He turned to face the room. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the casket, looking at the flowers, looking at the photograph. Then he said, "I would like to ask someone to speak for me, because he will say what I cannot." He looked at Harlan. Harlan stood. He walked to the front of that quiet little church in his vest and his boots. He turned to face 200 people who had no idea what he was doing there. He cleared his throat. "My name is Harlan Graves. About 4 years ago, a man named Frank Whitfield walked into a saloon where I was sitting. He was 81 years old. He had been driving for hours. His car was broken down. His wife was sick. He was afraid. And he asked me a question. 5 words. He said, 'Can my wife rest here?'" He paused. He looked at the casket. "I have been asked a lot of things in my life. I have been asked to fight. I have been asked to leave. I have been asked to pay for things I did and things I didn't do. But nobody had ever asked me what Frank asked me that day. Nobody had ever walked up to me and trusted me with the most important thing in their life. He trusted me with her." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Dorothy Whitfield did something that day that I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. She walked into a bar full of men she had never met. Men who looked like the kind of men you cross the street to avoid, and she sat down. She sat down with us. She ate soup at our table. She drank water from our glasses, and then she got up and she walked over to one of my brothers, a young man who had been to a war and come back broken, and she sat down with him too. She held his hand. She looked at his scars, and she told him he was not finished yet. He reached into his vest. He pulled out an envelope. It was cream-colored and slightly bent from being carried against his chest. He opened it. He unfolded the letter inside. His hands were shaking now visibly, and he did not try to hide it. "Dorothy wrote me a letter. I received it 3 weeks ago. I would like to read part of it if the family will allow me." Frank nodded. Harlan looked at the letter. He took a breath. "She wrote, 'Dear Harlan, by the time you read this, I will have gone ahead. I want you to know something that I have been meaning to say for 4 years, but could never find the right moment for. So I am writing it down because I am a nurse, and nurses write things down when they matter. You think you saved me that day at the bar. You think you gave me water and soup and a cool booth and a ride to my daughter's house, and that those things saved my life. And maybe they did, for a while. But that is not the whole truth. The whole truth, Harlan, is that I saved you. I walked into your bar and I sat down and I let you take care of me because I could see that you needed to take care of someone. I could see the weight you were carrying. I could see the promise you had made to your mother's grave and the guilt you were dragging behind you like a chain. And I knew that the only way to help you put it down was to let you pick me up. So I sat in your booth and I ate your soup and I let you guard the door. And when that man came in with his knife, I was afraid, Harlan. I was afraid, but I was more afraid of what would happen to you if you could not protect me. Because if you had failed that day, if you had not been able to keep your promise, it would have broken you. And you had been broken enough. I saved you, Harlan, and you know it. And I am glad. I am glad because saving people is what I have done my whole life, and you were the last one, and you were the best one. Build your bridge. It goes both ways. Harlan folded the letter. He put it back in his vest. He stood at the front of the church for a long moment, looking at the floor, looking at nothing, looking at everything. Then he looked up. Dorothy Whitfield let me sit down. She let all of us sit down. He walked back to the front pew. He sat down. Elaine, who had stared at a row of bikers from her porch 4 years before, with her hand over her mouth, leaned over and put her head on Harlan Graves' shoulder, and she cried into his vest. Harlan put his arm around her. On his other side, Frank reached over and put his hand on Harlan's knee. The same knee that had knelt beside a bar booth 4 years ago. The same knee that had popped like a gunshot when Harlan bent down to look a dying woman in the eye and tell her she was going to be all right. The story traveled after that. It traveled the way stories travel when they are true and when the truth in them is something people need to hear. A nurse at the hospice told it to her sister. Tom told it at the high school where he taught, and one of his students wrote about it for a college application essay, and the admissions counselor who read it called her husband that night and told him about it over dinner. And her husband told his coworkers the next morning, and one of those coworkers told a reporter. A small-town newspaper picked it up, then a bigger one. A reporter found Harlan. Harlan did not want to be interviewed. He said the story was not about him. The story, he said, was about Dorothy and Frank, about what they had asked for, about what people are still willing to give if you ask them the right way. The reporter wrote the story anyway because the story did not belong to Harlan or to Dorothy or to Frank. It belonged to everyone who had ever wondered quietly in the corners of their own lives whether kindness still lived in this country, whether the people we are taught to fear are really what we have been told they are, whether a stranger can still walk into a room full of strangers and ask for the smallest thing and have it given freely. Bones is 32 now. He does not go by Bones anymore. He goes by Marcus. He works at the VA hospital 3 days a week as a peer counselor for veterans with PTSD. He has a small apartment with a dog named Chester II because the original Chester retired from therapy work and went to live with Dr. Hale's mother in Florida. Marcus still rides with the Iron Wolves on weekends. He still has the scars on his wrists. He does not hide them. When a new veteran comes into the counseling room and sits down and stares at the floor and does not speak, Marcus rolls up his sleeves and puts his hands on the table, palms up and says, "My name is Marcus. An old woman sat with me once in a bar and told me I wasn't finished yet. She was right. Now tell me about you." He keeps Dorothy's letters in the shoebox under his bed, all 47 of them. He has read each one more times than he can count. The last one arrived 3 days before she died. It was short. It said, "Dear Marcus." It said, "I am proud of you." It said, "That is all. Love, Dorothy." Michael Whitfield is 21. He graduated from community college last spring and transferred to the State University to study criminal justice. He wants to be a police officer. Not the kind who chases people, the kind who stops, the kind who gets out of the car. When people ask him why, he tells them about a summer evening when he was 17 and his grandparents pulled into the driveway surrounded by 12 motorcycles, and his grandfather called them the best men he had ever met. Frank Whitfield is 86 years old. He lives with Elaine now in the small white house with the porch swing and the basketball hoop and the marigolds that Elaine plants every spring in her mother's memory. The same marigolds, the same colors, the same corner of the garden, where the afternoon light hits just right. He moves slowly. His left knee, the one with the Chinese shrapnel from Korea, has gotten worse. He uses a cane now, A wooden one with a rubber tip that Dorothy bought him 3 years ago and that he refused to use while she was alive because he did not want her to see him getting old. She knew, of course. She always knew. He does not drive anymore. The Buick sits in the garage, washed and waxed and quiet, a pale blue monument to a journey that ended and a journey that did not. Frank goes out to the garage sometimes and sits in the driver's seat with the door open and puts his hands on the wheel and closes his eyes. He does not start the engine. He does not need to. He can hear it. He can feel the road beneath him. He can feel Dorothy's hand on his knee. He can hear the thunder of 12 Harleys around him, the sound of being protected, the sound of being loved by people who had no reason to love him, except that he had asked for the smallest thing, and they had given him everything. On clearer summer evenings, Frank sits on the porch swing with a glass of cold water and watches the fireflies come out over the yard. He listens to the crickets. He listens to the birds settling into the trees for the night. He listens to the sounds that the world makes when it is getting ready to sleep. The small sounds, the quiet sounds, the sounds that most people do not hear because they are too busy or too distracted or too afraid to sit still long enough to listen. And sometimes far off on the highway, he hears the sound of a motorcycle, that low rolling thunder that once made him afraid and now makes him something else entirely. Not nostalgic, not sad, something that does not have a word, something that lives in the space between memory and hope, between what was lost and what was found, between a bar on a mountain road and a porch swing in a small town, and the 4 years of grace that connected them. In the drawer of his bedside table next to a photograph of Dorothy on their wedding day, and a pair of her reading glasses that he cannot bring himself to put away, and a dried marigold from her garden that Elaine pressed in a book and gave him last Christmas, there is a folded piece of paper with a phone number that still works. Frank has never called it again. He does not need to. The man on the other end of that number comes to him now. He comes without being called because that is what family does. And every so often on a Sunday afternoon when the light is long and gold and the shadows of the trees stretch across the yard like fingers reaching for something they cannot quite touch, a sound comes up the lane. A single engine, deep and steady, not a roar, a murmur. The sound a motorcycle makes when it is going slow out of respect for the neighborhood, out of respect for the old man on the porch who is listening for it. An enormous bearded man in a leather vest pulls into the driveway. The bike settles on its kickstand with a sound like a sigh. He gets off. He pulls off his gloves. He tucks them into his belt. He stands for a moment in the driveway, looking at the house, at the marigolds, at the porch swing, at the old man who is already getting to his feet, already reaching for the screen door, already smiling. He walks up the porch steps. His boots are heavy on the wood. His vest creaks the way it has always creaked. His beard is longer now, more gray than dark, and the tattoos on his neck have faded slightly. With the years, the way all marks fade, the way all stories soften, the way all sharp edges round themselves with time and use and love. He does not knock. He has not knocked in 4 years. He does not have to. He has a key, though he has never used it. Elaine gave it to him at the funeral, pressed it into his palm while she was crying into his vest, and said, "You are family now, and family does not knock." He carries the key on the same ring as the key to his motorcycle. 2 keys, 2 machines, 2 ways of getting to the people who matter. Frank Whitfield opens the screen door. He stands there in the late afternoon light, 86 years old, thin as a fence post, leaning on the cane that Dorothy bought him, wearing the flannel shirt that Dorothy ironed for him the week before she died, and that he has not washed since because it still smells like the lavender detergent she used, and he is not ready to let that go. His eyes have seen a frozen hill in Korea, and a smoking car on a mountain road, and a knife in a bar room, and a casket lowered into the earth. Eyes that have seen the worst and the best of what people can do to each other, and have decided after 86 years of evidence that the best is more common than the worst, and that the world is on balance a place where a man can ask for help and receive it. He says Harlan. And Harlan Graves, who once slammed his fist down on a wooden bar and stopped a whole room cold, who rode 2 hours through 12-degree weather to jumpstart an old man's car, who stood in a church in his leather vest and read a dying woman's letter to 200 strangers and broke down crying in front of people he did not know. Because the words in that letter were the truest words anyone had ever written about him, who carries that letter in his vest pocket, still pressed against his heart like a second heartbeat, who has built a bridge with his bare hands out of the wreckage of a gas station in West Texas and a prison cell in Huntsville, and a promise made at a mother's grave puts a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder and says, "Sir." And the word is not a greeting. It has not been a greeting for a long time. It is the thing that passes between two men who found each other on the worst day of their lives and built something out of it that neither one of them expected, and neither one of them deserves, and neither one of them would trade for anything in this world. It is a bridge, and it goes both ways.